I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are bleeding out in the middle of a scorching desert.
Oh, wow. Okay, starting intense.
Yeah, we are jumping right in. So you're miles from civilization, you are physically compromised, maybe you're dealing with a venomous bite or, a severe biological infection,
Right.
and your core temperature is just skyrocketing. Now, your ancient ancestors, faced with this exact scenario, what would they do?
Well, historically speaking, they'd probably fall to their knees.
Exactly. They would fall to their knees, chant to the sky, and basically beg for a magical intervention while they slowly expired in the sand.
Yeah, just hoping the universe breaks its own rules to save them.
Right. But what if I told you that the oldest, most foundational historical texts we have didn't actually prescribe magic for this scenario?
I mean, that would completely upend how most people view ancient texts.
It really would. What if, instead of a magic spell, those texts actually told you to, diagnose the systemic deficit, apply a tourniquet, locate a cool mineral spring to drop your core temperature, and synthesize a botanical poultice to fight the infection?
It would shatter the whole paradigm. It would mean that what we've been told is religion or, mythology is actually a highly advanced manual for surviving a hostile universe.
Yes, and if you're listening to this deep dive right now, you are probably having a really hard time letting go of the comic book versions of history.
Oh, it's tough. We're conditioned to see it that way.
I know I am. It is genuinely tough to strip the magic away from stories we learned when we were kids.
Absolutely. Usually when we talk about ancient texts, specifically the ones we label as religious, we expect a fairy tale.
We really do.
You open the book, and suddenly the laws of physics are just suspended. The oceans part by magic, and the heroes literally have superpowers. It's comforting, in a way.
It's incredibly comforting, and I mean, more importantly, it requires absolutely nothing of us intellectually.
Exactly. We get to just sit back, eat our popcorn, and watch the magic show. We are treated as these passive observers in a universe run by a capricious wizard.
But when you step into the world of socio-political engineering and raw systemic logic, that magical lens doesn't just crack, it shatters into a million pieces.
It really does. Because the historical landscape we're looking at today is rigorously, brutally practical. It is a world governed by absolute cause and effect.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We're looking at a specific block of source material today, Surah Al-Anbiya, verses 81 through 88.
A fascinating section, truly.
It is. Now, the traditional superstitious narratives that most people associate with this exact text are, well, they're wild. Honestly, they sound like a Disney movie.
They really do.
You have King Solomon commanding tiny, invisible red demons to dive into the ocean and fetch pearls.
Right, the classic magic rings and demons trope.
Exactly. You have Job sitting in a literal pile of garbage, covered in boils and worms, until a magical spring just sprouts out of the dirt for him.
Poof, out of nowhere.
Yeah, poof. And of course, the granddaddy of them all, Jonah, chilling out inside the literal stomach of a giant whale, singing prayers in the dark until the beast magically coughs him up onto a beach, completely unharmed.
We have to flatly reject this entire mythological worldview right out of the gate.
We have to.
What we are seeing in these traditional, centuries-old interpretations are infantile placeholders. That's all they are. They are theological cliches.
Placeholders for what, though?
Well, they have been artificially constructed over centuries by later empires to mask profound socio-political, economic, and psychological laws. They took a master class in infrastructure management and turned it into a bedtime story.
Well, wait, hold on. I have to push back here before we go any further, because this is a big claim.
Sure, go ahead.
You are asking me and the listener to take narratives that have been considered sacred, literal truth by billions of people for centuries and just toss them out as infantile placeholders? Isn't that a massive leap? I mean, aren't we just projecting a secular, hyper-modern tech bro worldview backward onto ancient spiritual texts just to make them sound cool?
I get why you'd ask that. That is the natural objection. But it fundamentally misunderstands what these texts originally were.
Okay, lay it out for us.
To understand this, we have to establish a core dichotomy that our sources highlight brilliantly. It is the vast, unbridgeable gulf between what is traditionally called madhab and the actual original operational concept of deen.
Let's unpack this, because this distinction feels like the key that unlocks the whole thing for the listener. How exactly are we defining those two terms?
So madhab is what you were describing when you talk about billions of people holding on to sacred, magical stories. It translates roughly to a religion of mere rituals.
Like just praying and fasting.
Right. Praying, fasting, retreating to a monastery, and passively waiting for a miracle to solve your problems. It is a private, highly emotional belief system.
Okay, and Dean.
Deen, on the other hand, is not a religion in that sense at all. It is a comprehensive geopolitical operating system.
A geopolitical operating system, that is a massive shift in definition.
It is. It is meant to revolutionize society, dismantle physical tyranny, and manage real-world infrastructure. The historical figures we call prophets were not sitting on prayer mats all day counting beads and waiting for lightning bolts.
They were busy.
Very busy. They were elite agents of change. They were tasked with implementing a system of justice in the real physical world. They dealt with macroeconomics, hostile labor forces, supply chains, and political rebellions.
So if they aren't wizards casting spells, who are they? I mean, how do we prove to the listener that this text is actually an engineering manual and not a spell book?
To prove it, we have to do a deep, unforgiving linguistic audit. We can't rely on later translations.
Because those translations were biased.
Highly biased. We have to strip away centuries of superstitious translation, much of which was funded by despotic empires, by the way, because those empires wanted passive, superstitious subjects rather than critical thinkers.
Oh, that makes total sense. Keep the people waiting for magic so they don't rebel against the state.
Exactly. So we have to look at the actual linguistic data of these operations. We need to look at the 7th century Arabic roots.
All right, let's jump straight into the deep end then. I want to look at the linguistic root of a word that is absolutely ubiquitous. Sabahu, or tasbih.
Oh, this is a perfect starting point.
Right? Because if you ask almost anyone today what tasbih means, they picture someone sitting quietly in a corner, holding a string of 99 beads, repeating a religious phrase over and over again.
That is the standard madhab view, yes.
But our sources point out that when this word is used in the context of King David, the text says the mountains and the birds were doing tasbih with him.
Which is where the myth starts.
Exactly. The traditional view is that literal granite rocks and literal pigeons were singing religious chants with King David.
Which, from a rational scientific standpoint, is an absurdity that violates the foundational laws of nature. Rocks do not possess the biological or cognitive apparatus to sing.
Obviously. So what is actually happening?
Well, if we trace the etymological root of the word sabahu in ancient Arabic, we find it has absolutely nothing to do with sitting still and chanting.
And what does it actually mean?
The root meaning of sabahu is to be actively engaged, to swim fast, or to move swiftly and consistently in a specific unified direction.
Wait, to swim fast?
Yeah, to be in rapid coordinated motion. In a systemic context, it implies maintaining absolute operational consistency within a larger mechanism.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize this. You're saying David didn't have a choir of singing mountains?
Not at all. What the sources reveal is that mountains and birds in this specific historical context are sociological and military terms.
Like designations for groups of people?
Yes. David had a massive, highly disciplined industrial and military apparatus running at peak efficiency. In the ancient Arabic context, specific human tribes were often named after animals or topographical features.
Wait, like how we have sports teams today called the Philadelphia Eagles or the Chicago Bears?
Exactly like that.
Or how military units have designations like the Screaming Eagles or the Mountain Division?
Precisely. There was a swift, highly mobile cavalry or reconnaissance unit, a tribe known as the Birds, Altair.
Okay.
And there were fierce, unyielding, physically imposing tribes that dwelled in the highlands, known as the mountains, Al-Jabal.
So when the text says the mountains and the birds were engaged in tasbih with David, it means these human tribes were integrated into his geopolitical operating system.
You've got it. They were working with absolute operational consistency.
That is wild.
It is. Remember, David was a master metallurgist. The text explicitly states in other areas that he was taught how to engineer coats of mail, armor.
So he wasn't doing parlor tricks, melting iron with his bare hands like the myths suggest?
No, he built massive furnaces. He established an industrial complex. The mountain tribes and the swift cavalry units were working in his foundries, securing his supply lines, extracting ore, and maintaining the operational consistency of a massive geopolitical state.
And that operational consistency is the tasbih.
Exactly.
Okay, but if David set up the industrial hardware, that hardware is absolutely useless without a global distribution network.
Which brings us to the next phase of the operation.
Right, and that is exactly the geopolitical leap we see the text make when it shifts to his son, Solomon, in verse 82. David built the base. Solomon expanded it into a global logistics empire.
A massive expansion.
But this is where I really need you to explain yourself, because this is where the most famous myth of all time comes in. The jinn and the shayatin.
The invisible demons of the fairy tales.
Yes. The traditional story, the one everyone knows, says Solomon had an army of literal, invisible, horned demons who built his temples, and he commanded them to dive to the bottom of the ocean to get him magical pearls.
It's a great visual for a cartoon, but historically absurd.
Now, I have to challenge you on this. Jinn means hidden spirit. It has meant that for thousands of years in the cultural zeitgeist.
In the popular culture, sure.
Are you really trying to tell me that a word associated with supernatural entities is just a logistics issue? Isn't that a massive linguistic stretch to force a modern secular interpretation onto an ancient text?
It's not a stretch at all if you actually look at the sociology of 7th century Arabia and the strict etymology of the Arabic language.
Mm-hmm.
We have to ignore the Persian or Babylonian folklore that bled into the translations centuries later.
Okay, so what is the strict etymology?
The root word jana simply means something that is hidden from sight. It's actually where we get the word jana for a lush garden, because the dense canopy of trees hides the soil from the sun.
Okay, that makes linguistic sense.
So in the sociological context of that era, humanity was divided broadly into two demographic categories.
What were they?
You had inns, which referred to civilized urban populations. These are people living in visible, settled communities, cities, and agricultural hubs. They were in plain sight.
The city dwellers.
Right. And then you had the jinn. This referred to the nomadic tribes, the Bedouins, the outlanders who lived deep in the mountains, the dense forests, or the vast trackless deserts.
Ah, so they were geographically and socially hidden from the urban eye.
Exactly. They were human tribes living completely outside the centralized state apparatus.
So you're saying jinn just meant rural, nomadic human beings who lived off the grid?
Yes, human beings.
Yeah.
Now, within that massive demographic of the off-grid jinn, you had specific, highly volatile subfactions known as shayatin.
And what does that root mean?
Linguistically, a shaitan is someone who is fiercely rebellious, a rule breaker, a hostile entity detached from the mainstream order.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see where this is going now. We aren't talking about ghosts.
Not at all.
We are talking about hostile labor forces. We are talking about pirates, rogue seafaring clans, rebellious mountain militias.
Yes. Solomon didn't run a supernatural circus. He ran an advanced maritime empire long before the era of steamships. He inherited a massive geopolitical state from David.
And to run that state, he needed resources.
Raw resources and infrastructure. He didn't use a magic wand. He conquered and conscripted these fiercely rebellious, highly skilled nomadic and seafaring factions. The text literally says he conscripted skilled deep-sea divers, yakusuna lahu, to extract oceanic resources.
Like pearls, coral, maritime wealth to fund the empire's expansion.
Precisely. But because these were shayatin, fiercely rebellious, hostile labor pools, he couldn't just ask them nicely to work a 9-to-5 shift.
Right, they were a massive security threat. They just hijacked the shipments.
Exactly. So the text explicitly notes how he handled them. It says he kept them under tight military surveillance. Wa kuna lahum hafizin.
Wow.
This means they were bound, secured, or kept in check by a strict penal and administrative system.
So he essentially had a highly monitored, possibly indentured or conscripted labor force. If they rebelled or tried to pirate his shipments, they faced severe state-sanctioned punishment.
Exactly. This completely reframes Solomon. He wasn't a wizard with a magic ring commanding poltergeists. He was a master of supply chain logistics and hostile labor management.
That is just incredible. He was a state builder dealing with real-world infrastructure problems and the very real threat of violent labor uprisings.
And we see this exact same mechanical mastery in how he managed his maritime fleet. The sources discuss how Solomon mastered the technology of the wind.
Oh, I wanted to get to this part.
The text says Bemrihi, meaning by his command or directional navigation. Now, the Madhab traditionalists read he commanded the wind, and they literally think he walked out onto a balcony, yelled at the sky, and the barometric pressure of the planet magically altered to push his boats.
Which, again, violates the universe's absolute law of cause and effect. I mean, God does not break his own physical laws to accommodate a human's travel itinerary.
Perfectly stated.
So how do we explain the wind obeying his command without magic? Because we were talking about an era long before internal combustion engines. Global trade required absolute mastery of wind currents.
What it actually means is that his maritime engineers mastered the art of tacking. They mastered sail technology. The wind moved according to his command, in the sense that his fleet knew how to harness the natural laws of aerodynamics.
Oh, I love this. Let's break down the mechanics of that for a second, because tacking is actually a profound scientific achievement for that era.
It really is.
When you are sailing, you can't just wait for the wind to blow in the exact direction you want to go. If you want to sail north, but the wind is blowing south, a primitive sailor is just stuck.
They just sit there.
But Solomon's fleet figured out how to use the Bernoulli principle. They figured out that if you angle a triangular sail correctly against the wind, the air travels faster over one side of the sail than the other.
Creating a pressure differential.
Exactly. Aerodynamic lift. It's literally the exact same physics that allow a 747 airplane to take off. The wind pushes the boat sideways, but the keel under the water resists the sideways motion, so the lift forces the boat to move forward angularly against the wind.
That is a brilliant explanation, and that is exactly what the text means. Solomon's fleet could direct their ships wherever the state required, regardless of the baseline wind direction.
They didn't ask the universe to break its rules.
No, they studied the rules, the fluid dynamics and aerodynamics, and they built technology that could exploit the system.
That is just, it's staggering. When you realize that these ancient texts encode this level of mechanical and sociological knowledge, it completely shatters our arrogance about historical intelligence.
It really does. We think we are so much smarter than them.
Right. The mythological view creates a passive believer who waits for miracles. The systemic, Quranic view, the deen, creates an active, intellectually fierce agent who studies aerodynamics, fluid dynamics, metallurgy, and sociology to build a resilient civilization.
It is the ultimate testament to human agency within a logical universe.
Okay, so Solomon shows us how to master external systemic power. Logistics, military strategy, wind currents, hostile labor forces.
All external factors.
Right. But external mastery is only half the battle. What happens when the crisis isn't an outside rebellion, but an internal collapse? What happens when the biological system itself, or the localized resource system, completely fails?
That is a crucial pivot.
To understand that, we have to shift our focus from the macro state to the individual biological organism. We were looking at the figure of Job, or Ayub, in verses 83 and 84.
This is the ultimate case study in the engine of reason, and it's a brutal critique of what we might call the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Let's lay out the fable of Job first for the listener, because it is so deeply ingrained in our cultural psyche.
It's everywhere.
The traditional story goes like this. Job was a wealthy, righteous man. God decides, basically on a whim or a bet with the devil, to test him. He strips him of his wealth, kills his children in a house collapse, and covers his entire body in horrific, painful boils and worms.
Just utter devastation for no logical reason.
Right. And then Job supposedly sits on a pile of ash and garbage outside the city gates for years. His wife is the only one who stays with him, working as a servant just to buy him scraps of food.
And this is where it gets truly disturbing.
Yeah. According to the later mythological add-ons in certain traditions, Job gets frustrated one day and swears a sacred oath to God that if he ever gets cured, he is going to punish his loyal wife by beating her with 100 lashes.
It is grotesque.
It really is.
It gets worse. Finally, God magically cures him by making a spring burst out of the dirt. But now Job has a theological problem. He swore an oath to beat his wife 100 times, and you apparently can't break an oath to God.
Even an insane one.
Right. So God gives him a magical legal loophole. He tells Job to tie 100 tiny twigs together into a bundle and just tap his wife on the shoulder with it once. Boom. Oath fulfilled, domestic abuse averted through a technicality.
As an analyst of systemic logic, I find that entire narrative to be an insult to the dignity of human intellect.
It's like a bad sitcom plot. It is. Think about the psychological profile of the elite agents we were discussing. These are men who engineer civilizations, and we are expected to believe that one of them reacted to a biological crisis by sitting in the dirt for years, throwing a tantrum, and swearing to brutally beat the only person keeping him alive.
It makes no sense.
And that the creator of the universe is concerned with semantic legal loopholes utilizing twigs. It reduces profound systemic logic to an irrational, almost abusive domestic soap opera.
So let's tear down the comic book. When we strip away the Babylonian folklore, what is the actual rational reality of Job's crisis according to the strict linguistic data of the sources?
The text uses a very specific diagnostic word to describe Job's condition. Dur.
Dur. What does that mean systemically?
In systemic terms, dur is a severe distress code. It denotes intense physical trauma, a debilitating disease, or total resource depletion. Job was dealing with a sudden, catastrophic biological and logistical collapse.
So he wasn't just sitting in a garbage dump.
No. He was likely stranded, perhaps separated from his caravan during travel in a hostile desert environment, suffering from extreme dehydration, exhaustion, and a severe physical affliction.
It's like a venomous bite from a desert snake or scorpion, or a rapid onset infectious disease that completely incapacitated him.
Exactly. He is in a state of acute biological crisis. His core temperature is likely spiking, his cellular integrity is compromised by venom or bacteria. And what is his response?
Well, he doesn't just sit there waiting for a magic wand, and he certainly doesn't curse the sky.
No, he takes a deeply scientific approach. Job doesn't resort to emotional, unproven assertions of self-pity. He presents his case to the universal law exactly like a scientist identifying a deficit in a mechanical system.
How does he phrase it?
His declaration in the text is incredibly precise. He says, "The stress parameters have reached my physical frame, and the system runs on absolute mercy."
I have to pause on that phrasing. The system runs on absolute mercy. Because it sounds poetic, but in an engineering context, he is identifying a constant in the universe.
Yes.
He is saying, if the universe has a biological mechanism for disease and cellular degradation, it must inherently contain the corresponding biological mechanism for recovery and cellular regeneration.
That is exactly what he is doing. He is stating a hypothesis based on the observable, balanced laws of nature. The universe does not run on random, chaotic accidents. It runs on strict cause and effect.
And the universal response to this.
The phrase is "Fajastajabna lahu." It is traditionally translated as "so he answered his prayer." But systemically, it means the automated, rational feedback loop of the universe was triggered by the correct inputs.
But those inputs weren't triggered by a magic spell. Job had to act, right? The universe didn't just beam health into his body from the clouds.
Correct. The specific instruction he receives from the system's logic is "Urkud birijlika," move your feet, or take a step.
So physical action.
Yes. He is not told to sit in the ash and wait for a miracle. He is instructed to take physical, agonizing action. He has to input the correct physical exertion to trigger the recovery sequence.
It's like a system administrator reading a critical error log on a server. The system says, biological integrity compromised, system failure imminent. The universe provides the natural laws of recovery, but the admin Job has to physically type in the command line. He has to drag himself forward through the desert.
And where does he drag himself? What is the physical destination of this action? He's guided to a cool spring. The text explicitly states it is a cool place to wash and drink. We have to look at the biology of this. This is hydrotherapy.
Right. If he is suffering from severe venom-induced fever or massive dehydration in a desert environment, his body is going into hypovolemic or septic shock.
Which is fatal if untreated.
Very fast. So finding a cool mineral spring is the exact biological input his system requires. By submerging himself in cool water, he causes peripheral vasoconstriction, which forces blood back to his vital organs.
It stabilizes him.
It rapidly lowers his core temperature, preventing his brain from cooking in his skull while simultaneously rehydrating his cellular structure. It is applied biology.
It is the pinnacle of rational medical intervention in antiquity. But it doesn't stop with hydrotherapy. We have to address the infamous 100 twigs, the supposed wife-beating loophole.
Yes, please explain how we rescue this text from that absurd interpretation.
The tragedy of that mythological translation hinges on a single word: daith.
Okay, what does daith mean?
Later theologians, trying desperately to justify the absurd fables they had absorbed from outside cultures, translated daith as a bundle of twigs used for a beating. But in the ancient botanical and medicinal context of the Arabic language, daith refers to a handful of branches, specifically herbs or botanical remedies.
So he is not gathering sticks to hit a woman. He is gathering medicinal herbs.
Precisely. The instruction he processes is to take a handful of these specific botanical elements and strike, or more accurately, apply them to the afflicted area, to the open wounds, the boils, or the site of the infection.
We are talking about the origin of pharmacology.
We absolutely are.
He is synthesizing a botanical poultice. We know today that ancient desert herbs possess powerful antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and antiseptic properties. He is crushing these herbs and applying them topically to draw out the infection.
He is using natural, earth-based medicine to treat a biological deficit. The critique of superstition here is brutal.
How so?
Well, our sources explicitly mock the idea of sitting around doing khatems. The practice of reading a specific verse 100,000 times over a glass of water while completely ignoring the physical laws of the universe.
Yeah, people still do that today.
If you have a snake bite, you don't sit and chant syllables. You apply a tourniquet, you extract the venom, you lower the patient's core temperature with hydrotherapy, and you apply an antimicrobial poultice to prevent secondary infection.
You do the work.
Job respected the cause and effect of the universe. That is why he survived. He didn't ask for the laws of biology to be suspended, he mastered them.
This completely changes the paradigm. Job maintained his physical integrity through hyper-rational action. He engineered his own biological resilience.
Yes, he did.
But how does this concept of structural integrity apply on a macro scale? I mean, biological resilience is one thing, but what about geopolitical resilience?
That forces us to pivot to the next part of the text, verses 85 and 86. We are looking at social physics and what our sources call the law of requital in action.
Okay, set the stage for us.
The text profiles three specific historical figures here:
Okay.
Ismail, Idris, and Du al-Kifli. And it categorizes all three of them with one very specific operational term, Mina al-Sabrin. They were of those who possessed saber.
Now, if you ask the average person on the street what saber means, they will instantly say patience.
Always.
And usually they mean it in a very passive, defeated way, like just suffer quietly, don't complain, and take the abuse.
Which is a slave morality. That interpretation of saber was engineered by despotic empires centuries later to keep their populations docile and compliant.
It's the ultimate tool for control.
It is. The message from the pulpit became, don't rebel against our corrupt taxation or our tyranny. Just have saber. Suffer in silence, don't cause friction, and you'll get a massive reward in the afterlife.
But in the context of these elite geopolitical operators, men who build empires and challenge corruption, that passive definition makes zero sense. You don't change the world by being a doormat.
It makes no sense at all. In the realm of social physics, saber is not passive, weak submission to suffering.
Yes.
It is high tensile structural integrity.
I want to run with an analogy here because structural integrity implies something that is heavily engineered to handle immense stress without failing.
Let's hear it.
If I think about a modern skyscraper being built in a massive earthquake zone like Tokyo or San Francisco, the engineers don't build that building to be completely rigid.
Right, because if it's rigid...
If it's rigid, made of brittle concrete, the first time a massive seismic wave hits, the kinetic energy will just snap the building in half. It will collapse. Instead, they engineer it with saber. They build it with massive hydraulic dampeners, flexible steel cores, and deep foundation rollers. It is explicitly designed to take the horrific kinetic energy of a magnitude 8.0 earthquake, to sway, to absorb the shock wave, but never ever to snap. It maintains its structural integrity under extreme external pressure.
That is a flawless analogy. Ismail, Idris, and Du al-Kifl were human skyscrapers. They were engineered with flexible steel cores.
Let's look at one of them closely.
Let's take Du al-Kifl as our primary case study here. Historically, this title, which means the one who maintains the guarantee or the one of the portion, is often identified with figures like the prophet Ezekiel during the Babylonian captivity of the Israelites.
Okay, let's paint the picture of the Babylonian captivity for the listener, because this is a scenario of absolute unmitigated geopolitical devastation.
The worst case scenario.
The entire nation has been militarily conquered by a superpower. Their capital city is burned to the ground, their institutions are shattered, and the surviving population is literally dragged in chains across the desert into slavery in Babylon.
It is a systemic collapse on every conceivable level: military, economic, cultural, and psychological. When a population is enslaved and relocated, the easiest, most mathematically probable thing to do is assimilate.
Just give up.
Yes, to surrender, to lose your cultural identity, abandon your operational consistency, and just blend into the empire. The external pressure to warp your values, to bow to the tyrant's gods, and to submit to the new power structure is overwhelming. It is a social earthquake of magnitude 9.0.
But Du al-Kifl exhibits saber. He acts as that flexible steel core for his enslaved people.
He maintained absolute operational consistency while his people were in chains. He refused to let the external pressures of Babylonian tyranny warp their strategic alignment with justice and their core constitutional values.
To keep the resistance alive.
He did. But he didn't do it through chaotic, premature, suicidal violence. He did it through ironclad psychological and organizational resilience. He absorbed the kinetic shock of slavery, but he refused to let the community snap.
And what is the systemic result of this high tensile resilience? Because the text says it triggers something very specific.
It triggers the law of requital. Because these leaders maintain their structural integrity, the system automatically responds. The text says, "Adkalanahum fi rahmatina." We integrated them into our mercy.
But mercy here isn't a sentimental pat on the head from the sky.
No, in systemic terms, it means they were integrated into the core zone of systemic protection.
So, because they aligned their actions with the universal constants of justice, organization, and resilience, the universe's socio-political laws naturally protected them and eventually facilitated their liberation.
Exactly. The Babylonian Empire, which was built on tyranny, corruption, and brittle brute force, eventually collapsed under its own unsustainable weight.
It was too rigid.
Too rigid. Meanwhile, the resilient community, anchored by Du al-Kifl's saber, survived the collapse and regenerated.
Action and reaction, cause and effect.
If you build a society with saber, with engineered structural integrity, it will survive the earthquake of geopolitical crisis. If you build it on corruption and tyranny, it is rigid and brittle, and it will inevitably collapse. There is no magic involved,
Yeah.
just the relentless laws of social physics.
It is honestly mind-blowing when you lay it out like this. We've seen how Solomon managed external maritime and labor systems without magic. We've seen how Job managed an internal biological collapse through pharmacology. We've seen how Du al-Kifl managed the psychological collapse of an enslaved nation through structural integrity.
They all follow the systemic protocol perfectly.
But that raises the most critical question of all. What happens when an elite operator makes a structural miscalculation? What happens when the human element fundamentally fails?
And that pivot brings us to the ultimate example of a systemic error, the reality of Jonah, or Eunice, in verse 87.
If you are listening, brace yourself, because we are about to murder another childhood story.
We really have to completely, aggressively abandon the Disney version of this story.
Right. So the traditional story, which every kid learns in Sunday school or at the mosque, Jonah is a prophet. He gets mad at his people for not listening to him. He storms off, gets on a boat.
God gets angry and sends a storm.
Right. Jonah gets thrown overboard and is immediately swallowed whole by a giant whale. He lives in the whale's stomach, which apparently has breathable oxygen, for 3 days in the pitch dark.
Naturally.
He realizes he messed up, sings a magical prayer, and the whale burps him up onto a beach. Perfectly fine.
It is functionally identical to a fairy tale like Pinocchio.
No.
Let's look at the actual geopolitical and logistical reality described in the linguistic data of our sources.
Who was Jonah, really?
Jonah was an elite agent assigned to a highly volatile geopolitical post, a city historically identified as Nineveh. His operational mandate was to implement a system of justice and warn the population of the inevitable socioeconomic collapse that their corrupt, extractive practices would inevitably bring.
But the people didn't listen. They mocked him. They aggressively resisted the operational changes he was trying to implement.
And Jonah experienced human frustration. The text says he left Mogadaban in a state of intense anger. He made a strategic exit from his post before he received authorized clearance from Central Command from God, the ultimate authority of the universal system he served.
He abandoned his post. He went AWOL.
Yes. And he did so, assuming he wouldn't be held accountable. The text captures his internal thought process perfectly. Fazana anlan natiralihi.
What does that translate to traditionally?
Traditionally, this is translated as, he thought we had no power over him, which makes no sense for a prophet to think. But systemically, it means he assumed there would be no strict accountability or negative systemic consequence for his executive decision.
He rationalized it.
He thought, I'm the elite agent, the people are corrupt, I'm justified in leaving, the system won't penalize me.
Our sources call this an ijtihadi mistake.
Exactly. It wasn't a malicious, evil rebellion against God. It was an error in executive judgment. He made a localized tactical decision that blatantly violated the overarching strategic protocol. He arrogantly thought he knew better than the system.
So he leaves his post, heads to the coast, and boards a transport ship. And this is where the logistics of his decision completely fail.
He boards an overloaded transport boat. We are talking about ancient maritime travel in the Mediterranean or Near Eastern waterways.
Dangerous even on a good day.
Very.
Yeah.
He is fleeing, likely in a frantic hurry, and gets onto a commercial vessel that is carrying cargo and passengers well beyond its safe capacity. A storm hits, or the waters simply become turbulent, and because the boat is overloaded and sitting too low in the water, the crew has to jettison weight to prevent a capsize.
And Jonah ends up going overboard into the crushing waves.
And here comes the giant whale to swallow him whole.
Right. Wait, no whale.
No whale. The Arabic word used in other accounts, hut, can mean a large fish, but the profound textual focus in Surah Al-Anbiya is on the physical and psychological environment he finds himself in. The Quran describes his situation as elgam.
Algam. What does that mean?
This translates to a state of absolute suffocation, intense darkness, and total physical containment. He is trapped in the crushing, dark, chaotic waves of the sea, completely isolated.
Okay, but if he is thrown into a raging sea at night, why doesn't he just immediately drown?
Because, as the text points out in a related verse, he was of the musabihin. Remember our earlier definition of sabahu?
Active engagement, swift movement.
Exactly. Jonah was a master swimmer. He was physically conditioned. He had the tactical skills and the kinetic stamina to tread water and survive the immediate impact of going overboard.
Ah, so he didn't just sink like a stone.
But physical skill isn't enough when you were in a dead-end containment zone in the middle of a dark ocean. He was physically and psychologically trapped by the inevitable consequences of his own executive error.
He is treading water in the pitch black. The freezing waves are crashing over him. He is exhausted, his muscles are cramping, and he realizes he's going to die out there. And this is where we get the famous declaration, verse 87, Inni kuntu mina azalimin.
Yes, indeed, I have been of the wrongdoers.
Now, I have to point something out that our sources mention because it is absolutely infuriating when you think about it. Today, millions of people use this exact phrase as a magical cheat code.
Oh, the exam phenomenon.
Yes, students will literally gather together, lay out dates or prayer beads, and chant Inni kuntu mina al-zalimin 125,000 times the night before a calculus exam, genuinely thinking the acoustic sound waves of their chanting will magically change the grade on their paper.
It is the ultimate degradation of a profound psychological technology. They have taken a desperate life-or-death cognitive reset and turned it into an empty incantation.
So how do we pull Jonah's words out of the realm of magic? What is actually happening in Jonah's brain when he says this while drowning?
It is a brutal, open-source data audit of his own actions. Jonah is treading water in the dark, and his mind is racing, and he finally runs the objective diagnostics on how he got into this water.
A moment of clarity.
He realizes that his crisis was not caused by an angry god throwing a lightning bolt at his boat. It wasn't caused by bad luck. It was caused exclusively by his unearned asymmetric deviation from the protocol.
He admits his own structural miscalculation.
Exactly. The word zulm, which is often lazily translated as wrongdoing, literally means putting something where it does not belong. It means creating an asymmetry in a balanced system.
So he sees the asymmetry.
Jonah realizes, I created an asymmetry. I abandoned my post. I made an executive error. My zulm caused this exact crisis.
He stops blaming external factors. He doesn't blame the people of Nineveh for being stubborn. He doesn't blame the boat captain for overloading the ship. He doesn't blame the weather. He takes absolute, unvarnished, terrifying ownership of his failure.
And that ownership is predicated on his recognition of the cosmic law. Before he admits his fault, he says, Sopanica, glory to you.
Which means what, systemically?
Systemically, it means your laws are absolute, pristine, and unyielding. He is acknowledging that the universe's cause and effect operated flawlessly. He broke the protocol, and the system delivered the exact logical mathematical consequence. The system isn't broken. He is.
That cognitive realization is the escape hatch.
Yes. The exact moment he stops projecting blame and aligns his cognitive framework with absolute reality, the psychological panic stops. His mind clears.
He can actually think.
He stops fighting the reality of his error and begins to calculate his way out. This brutal honesty resets his psychology. It lowers his heart rate. It gives him the clarity to utilize his skills as a master swimmer, to navigate the currents, find floating debris from the ship, and conserve his energy to reach the shore.
Wow.
Action and rational adjustment, born from extreme accountability, are what trigger the system's escape hatch, not empty chanting.
If you're listening, think about how phenomenal this paradigm shift is. If you are failing a math exam, chanting Jonah's prayer 100,000 times won't save you.
Not at all.
Realizing you spent all semester playing video games instead of studying, doing a brutal data audit of your own zulm, and then actually opening the textbook and studying, that is how you trigger the escape hatch. The system requires input.
Exactly. The law of requital demands action, not just words. Jonah survived because he corrected his internal data input, which allowed him to execute the correct physical output. He swam to safety because his mind was finally aligned with the truth.
Okay, let's bring this all together because we have covered incredible ground today. We started by stating that if you want a bedtime story, you're in the wrong place. And the texts have proven that 10 times over.
We have completely dismantled the fairy tales.
We looked at Solomon, Not a wizard with a magic ring, but an elite logistics operator managing a maritime empire, harnessing aerodynamic wind technology, and running tight military surveillance on volatile, rebellious labor pools, the shayatin.
A masterclass in statecraft.
Then we looked at Job. Not a passive victim waiting for magic dirt to cure him, but a rational agent diagnosing a systemic biological deficit and applying the natural laws of hydrotherapy and botanical pharmacology to engineer his own recovery.
True systemic resilience.
We looked at the social physics of dual kifl, demonstrating that saber isn't quiet suffering, it's the high tensile structural integrity required to survive the geopolitical earthquake of enslavement and tyranny.
Absorbing the shock without snapping.
And finally, Jonah. Not a man singing inside a whale, but an elite operator trapped in a dead-end containment zone caused by his own executive miscalculation, who saves himself through a brutal open-source data audit and taking absolute accountability.
The core takeaway is undeniable. The universe operates on strict, unyielding laws of cause and effect. Whether a society is dealing with hostile supply chains, severe biological health crises, or suffocating political dead ends, crying out for magic will not save you.
It's the ultimate difference between Madhab and Deen. Madhab waits for a miracle. Deen builds a ship, studies the wind, and applies a poultice.
It's exactly alignment with universal constants, rejecting unproven assertions, and taking calculated rational action is the only thing that guarantees a way out. Every single crisis we discussed today had a calculated exit because the agents involved eventually understood the system.
But, and there is always a but when we look at these systemic models, it forces us to ask a terrifying question. What happens when the system itself evolves?
I like where you're going with this.
If Solomon Shayatin were human, hostile labor forces that required constant surveillance, what are the Shayatin of our era? I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, algorithmic systems, autonomous networks.
The invisible forces of today.
Exactly. Are we building a new class of invisible, rebellious forces that operate off the grid of human comprehension? If we don't apply Solomon's level of strict architectural surveillance to these systems, are we engineering our own collapse?
That is a phenomenal thought experiment. The laws of infrastructure management apply regardless of the era. Whether it is a maritime labor force in the 7th century or an autonomous AI neural network in the 21st, if you deploy power without absolute surveillance and alignment with universal justice, the system will rebel.
And that thought perfectly bridges us to our next major problem. Because every crisis we looked at today involved individuals who had some level of physical agency left. Job had his arms to apply the medicine. Jonah had his physical ability to swim. Solomon had an army.
They had inputs they could use.
But what happens when the crisis seems mathematically impossible to reverse?
That is the ultimate systemic boundary. What happens when the crisis is absolute demographic extinction?
Oh, wow. Okay, where are we going with this?
I'm talking about a scenario where a movement, a civilization, desperately needs to regenerate its human capital, but its leadership base has reached extreme old age, and the biological reproductive window has completely, irrevocably slammed shut.
You're talking about the story of Zechariah and John.
I am. How does the law of nature bypass perceived biological constraints to jumpstart a generation? What are the mechanics of systemic acceleration when a society is on the brink of a genetic dead end? And furthermore, what happens when the barriers holding back global chaos are torn down, when the systems of Gog and Magog are unleashed?
That sounds like we are moving from localized crisis management to literal civilizational genetics and global collapse.
We absolutely are. Next time, in Lecture 11 out of 13, covering Surah 21, Ayat 89 through 96, we are going to look at the jaw-dropping mechanics of systemic acceleration. We are going to explore the genetics of civilizational continuity.
I can't wait.
You will see how elite agents engineered the survival of their lineage when the math said it was completely impossible.
So we've fixed the X-ray machine, we've cleared the muddy waters, the comic book placeholders have been thrown out, and we are finally looking at the real machinery of history. You won't want to miss the next one. Until then, think about those invisible algorithmic forces we're building and ask yourself if we have the operational consistency to control them. See you next time.